The count was at 389 when I stopped watching the board. I watched faces instead. In a chamber that communicated through light pulses and chemical signals and subsonic vibrations, I felt more than heard. Watching faces was the only honest data source available. You had to know not just what each expression meant, but which ones were genuine and which were being performed for the room, and learning that distinction across dozens of species had taken me 11 years and had never fully stopped costing me something. Selvorn, the Dorvathy ambassador, was in the third row. We had shared 11 diplomatic dinners across 4 years of careful relationship building. I had learned the 42 protocols that governed eating with his species and applied them without conscious thought by year 2. His people considered a shared meal a binding statement of alliance. His 4 interlaced fingers were pressing together in a slow, rhythmic pulse now. His bioluminescent skin held a steady amber glow. Amber meant satisfied. 6 months to learn that. I had written it in my field notes the day I confirmed it, underlined it, and used it to calibrate approximately 900 subsequent conversations. 390. Velon's voice carried no inflection. He had held the secretary position for 200 years, which was middle age for his species, and 2 centuries of proceedings had compressed every kind of announcement into the same flat, ceremonial tone. Historic votes and routine minutes delivered with identical energy. Numbers on a list. 391. 392. I rolled the pen between my fingers. Matte black, slightly chewed at the cap from a habit I was not proud of. I had bought it 11 years ago at the transit shop outside the station on the morning of my very first session, because I had left my good pen at home, because I had been nervous, because I had needed something to hold. It had cost almost nothing. It had been to 38 formal sessions, 6 emergency proceedings, 2 all-night negotiations that ended without resolution, and 1 that ended in something worse than nothing. I had never replaced it. 394. 2 hours earlier, Velon had entered the charge into the formal record in the same voice he used for everything: destabilizing influence, psychological incompatibility, chronic emotional volatility threatening interspecies equilibrium. He had given the word volatility an extra syllable it did not have. I had almost corrected him. The reflex was still there after 11 years, fast and automatic and embedded deep in diplomatic muscle memory. Find the common ground. Smooth the rough edge. Be the reasonable one in the room so that difficult things can still be said and heard across the distance between species. I kept the correction behind my teeth where it belonged. The chamber held 412 species and every seat was filled. That almost never happened. Full attendance was for events that operated at the scale of history. Wars. Extinctions. The collapse of old interstellar arrangements. Apparently expelling humanity from the galactic community qualified for the same category. I had prepared for this session as I had prepared for every session, which was to say thoroughly. A 27-minute speech, every line tested for clarity across translation systems. Notes on 6 delegations I considered genuinely persuadable based on relationship history and treaty alignment. 11 years of human contribution data compiled and cross-referenced, the trade routes we had opened, 3 interstellar conflicts we had helped pull back from the edge before they became something uncontrollable, medical research shared freely with 40 different species at no cost and with no expectation of reciprocity, cartographic surveys of 6 previously unmapped systems given to the Council's Science Division because we had done the work and they were useful. The session chair had given me 40 seconds to respond to the charge before calling the vote. 40 seconds. I had used 30. 397. In the far gallery, the SEKRA contingent was vibrating. Their resonance chambers, set into their thorax plates, produced a frequency I felt in my back teeth. I had learned in year 3 that this was their equivalent of enthusiastic approval. They had been vibrating since before the session formally opened, which told me precisely how much of this had been coordinated in advance of my arrival. I had been most hopeful about the Gretheli. Their systems bordered ours. We had maintained active trade routes for 40 years. 8 years back, when their atmospheric processors failed in a cascade event that threatened 200,000 lives, human engineering teams had been on site in 6 days and had the problem resolved in 11. Their ambassador, Drev, moved and spoke with the slow precision his species' diplomatic training produced, and last week over a drink he called coffee but that tasted like warm chalk, he had looked at me very carefully and said, "These proceedings concern me. I had interpreted that as a signal of support. This morning he had looked at everything in the room except me. 403. 404. I stopped watching the board entirely. I looked at the pen. I had taken it apart once, late at night in the station residential block when sleep was not available, laid every small component in a careful row on the desk, and put it all back together piece by piece. It had still worked afterward. I had been faintly reassured by that, in a way I chose not to examine too closely. 409. 409 in favor of expulsion. 3 opposed. The 3, Earth. The Velnoth, who held a 40-year water rights alliance with us and apparently still considered it worth something at this moment. And the Grethma, a quiet species from the outer Cygnus systems who had not spoken in a formal session in 30 years of council membership and chose this particular moment to have convictions they were willing to hold publicly. I had never met their delegation. I found, sitting in that chamber, that I would have very much liked to. The Dorvathy rose shifted from amber to gold. Gold was celebration. The color spread across the delegation in a slow, satisfied wave that I watched travel from left to right. Velon looked at me. He had the small decency to appear slightly uncomfortable about it, which I noted and filed. Ambassador Morton. Does the Earth delegation wish to enter a final statement before the record is closed? I let the question stand in the room. 412 species. The accumulated wisdom of civilizations that had existed when Earth was still working out the basic principles of agriculture. The great patient galactic community, gathered to determine in an orderly and civilized fashion that one particular species was simply too much trouble to keep around. 40 seconds. I laughed. Not performance. Not theater. Not a calculated diplomatic maneuver. Something in my chest found the shape of it genuinely funny, the clean geometric precision of it all. 11 years. 40 seconds. 409 raised hands. The SEKRA had been vibrating since before I sat down. In a room that communicated through light pulses and chemical gradients and subsonic resonance, one human woman laughing alone was a very specific kind of sound. It filled the chamber and came back from the walls slightly changed. Selvorn's gold flickered. They had been waiting for something that looked like collapse. Anger, perhaps, or a long principled speech about injustice that they could sit through politely and then dismiss without engagement. They had clearly put some thought into which of those responses they were most prepared to handle. I was done arguing with people who had finished listening before I opened my mouth. No statement, I said. I stood. I straightened my coat. I put the pen in my pocket. The council has been thorough. I thank everyone for their time. I walked out. The chamber doors sealed behind me. They made the sound of a breath that had been held a very long time, finally and completely let out. I stood alone in the corridor. Cold recycled air, the same air every station in every system in the galaxy circulated through the same standard filtration systems. It always smelled like filtered atmosphere and metal and the faint presence of thousands of different species living in the same enclosed space, and I had always found that smell oddly comforting. Proof that wherever you ended up, people had decided it was worth building something there. I took the pen out and looked at it for a moment. Transit shop pen. 11 years old. Slightly chewed. Worth almost nothing. I put it back. Ned Farrow was already running through the departure sequence when I boarded the shuttle. He was 40, practical, and reliably economical with words, which was why I had specifically requested him for this assignment 3 years before. He glanced at my face for exactly 1 second when I came through the hatch. A complete look, professional and unhurried. Then back to his instruments. Ready when you are, Ambassador. Ready, I said. We left the dock. Through the observation port I watched the council complex reduce itself to a single point of light among many. I watched it until it was indistinguishable from the rest. Then I stopped watching and turned my attention to the transit plan Farrow had mapped for the return home. 18 other human ships fell into quiet formation around us. Through the comm channel, the voices of their crews were calm and steady. They had all known this was coming. We had all known for a long time. Knowing does not make the door quieter when it shuts. 47 years would pass before I entered a council chamber again. The chairs would be in different positions. Every seat would be full. Every face in the room would be directed at me. None of them would be glowing gold. We have not reached that part yet. We have to go through what came between first. We have to go through the long, productive dark that the galaxy mistook for a species slowly disappearing. They thought we were going quiet because we were fading. They had confused silence with surrender for the last time. We had work to do. We got to work. Within 72 hours of our last ship clearing the Council's outermost monitoring perimeter, Earth went dark on all shared frequencies. No final broadcast. No ceremonial statement. No address to the galactic community we were leaving behind. We closed every diplomatic channel, stopped transmitting on shared comm frequencies, and dropped out of the galactic conversation entirely. From the outside, looking in through monitoring instruments, it must have looked exactly like the beginning of the end. From the inside, it felt like putting down something very heavy that we had been carrying for a very long time. The Council's monitoring stations recorded the silence within the first week. We knew this because we were still receiving their signals. We had kept that capability active because information was information, and we were not prepared to go blind simply because we were no longer participating. Their assessment, transmitted on trade frequency channels they had not thought to change or encrypt, read as expected, signs of internal instability. Probable decline of central coordination functions. No active threat assessment required. Continue passive observation at current resource allocation. They thought we were falling apart. The logic of this conclusion was not entirely unreasonable, from their perspective. They had expelled other species before us. Not many, but several. Smaller ones, mostly. Species that had genuinely depended on the Council's infrastructure networks, the trade routes that moved essential resources, the scientific exchange programs that sustained technological development, the diplomatic frameworks that prevented the kind of small border conflicts from becoming large destructive ones. Without those things, those species had faltered and contracted and, in a few cases, not recovered. What the Council did not account for, because no species they had expelled had ever been quite like us, was what happened when you stripped away every external rule, every framework imposed by civilizations that had spent 10,000 years optimizing for stability rather than progress, every ceiling built by people who had long since decided that where they were was good enough, and handed all of that empty space to a species that was already, and for very good reason, extremely angry about something. We built. Year 3, a team at Kepler Station completed the first functioning jump drive that required no relay anchor at the destination. Every FTL system in the galaxy, including the one the Council used, needed infrastructure at both ends of every transit corridor it served. You could not go somewhere that had not already been prepared for your arrival. Ours did not need preparation. We could go anywhere we could point a ship. The Council's own science division had published a paper 200 years earlier classifying such a drive as theoretically impossible. Several of our engineers had the paper printed and pinned above their workstations. One of them told me later that she had never found a cleaner statement of motivation. Year 7, our first atmospheric terraforming engine ran its initial field test on a world with a surface temperature capable of melting standard hull alloys. The test ran for 6 months. At the end of it, the surface had grass. Not well distributed, not lush, not anything that would make an agronomist comfortable. But grass, growing on a world that had no business supporting any organic life, which was more than it had the day we started. Year 11, Dr. Ruth Alden at the Meridian Research Station completed a medical synthesis process that could construct any known organic compound from base elements in under 4 hours. She had been working on this problem for 9 years. The process had failed 61 times across 3 successive research teams. On the 62nd attempt, she sat in the lab alone for 40 minutes before she called anyone, because she needed the time to understand what she had done before she had to explain it to someone else. I kept the pen. It had run dry in year 9, and I kept it anyway. It sat in the drawer of my desk at the Earth Diplomatic Administration, the title I had given my department when the Council no longer had a formal claim on my role, and on days when the work was long and the decisions were complicated, I took it out and rolled it between my fingers the way I had in that chamber. It helped me think. I cannot explain why, and I stopped trying to. The Council's monitoring equipment continued tracking the edges of human space from a careful distance throughout all of this. What they recorded confused their analysts considerably. Their instruments were well built and well calibrated. The problem was that they had been designed to read the universe that Council physicists understood. The energy signatures we were producing, the comm traffic patterns from our expanding network, the spatial distortions generated by our drive systems, none of it mapped cleanly onto their existing models. Their reports to each other, which we continued to intercept through the same frequency channels they had never bothered to secure, cycled through several competing interpretations over the years. Equipment malfunction was the most popular explanation from years 5 through 14. Anomalous radiation signatures from uncharted stellar phenomena was popular for a while in the 20s. From year 22 to year 27, the dominant theory was that we had experienced a catastrophic internal containment event involving experimental weapons. The correct interpretation, that the expelled species was conducting research and development at a level their instruments had simply not been calibrated to measure, did not appear in any of their formal assessments. It would not have occurred to them to look for it. Why would it? They had expelled us because we were too volatile to be useful. The logical outcome of expelling a volatile species was collapse, and their models confirmed what their assumptions required. In year 23, our survey ships crossed the old Council border. Not with any aggressive intent. We crossed it because we were mapping, because we had been expanding our survey range consistently since year 4, and the line on an old map had not seemed like a sufficient reason to stop. We were not performing defiance. We were simply not done. By year 30, the territory we actively inhabited and administered was 4 times the size it had been when the Council chamber doors closed behind me. Their monitoring stations near the old border began picking up our comm traffic during this period. Our own internal network, built to our own specifications on frequencies we had developed ourselves, was dense and complex by this point, the way any living system's internal communication becomes dense and complex when it is growing. To Council instruments listening from a distance, our network sounded like noise. To their analysts, the noise was growing louder year by year, which their models said made no sense for a civilization in decline. They filed it under anomalous data and continued passive observation. General Owen Drake came to my office in year 31. He was 56, heavily built in the way that long military careers produce in people who have learned over decades precisely when to be still and when to move. He sat across from me and put a report on the desk between us without preamble, because Drake had never wasted words on approaches when directness was available. "You remember the 5 flag systems from the year 23 surveys," he said. "I remember," I said. "This is the follow-up analysis. 16 months of close observation." He turned the report to face me and opened it to the relevant section. Something large operated in those systems. Recently, within the last 50 to 80 years. We are finding the evidence of it. The images were not structures in any recognizable sense. They were more like aftermath, distributed traces of very large-scale activity spread across a substantial area. Transit debris consistent with enormous objects passing through the same corridors repeatedly. Energy dispersal patterns from something that produced energy on a scale that made our own output look modest. Material degradation signatures that our analysts had run through every known reference database before concluding they did not match anything in the record. Where did they come from? I asked. They were already there, Drake said. We moved into their territory. The question is where they went. He turned to the last page. A system map. An arrow, pointing inward. Toward the Council's core worlds. I took the pen out of my drawer without thinking about it. Deepen the survey, I said. Full resources. Full operational discretion. I want to know what this is before we take any other step. At the door he paused. Do you think the Council knows about whatever this is? I thought about Selvorn's amber shifting to gold. About Drev and his chalk-flavored coffee and his sudden inability to hold my eyes. About 40 seconds. I think, I said, the Council has always been very good at knowing things it chooses not to mention. He left. Year 41, Captain Lena Boyd's patrol ship picked up an incoming vessel at the outer edge of our expanded territory. Fast, moving without a filed route, not responding to standard hailing. Boyd followed it because Boyd approached every situation she did not fully understand the same way. She got closer and gathered data until she did understand it. What she found when the full picture came into resolution was not a mystery anymore. It was an answer. The kind that, when you finally hold it, makes you understand exactly why no one had handed it to you. She sent me an encrypted transmission at 3 in the morning station time. I read it twice. Called Drake. The 6 years that followed were the most productive years of preparation in human history. In year 47, on a gray morning in early station autumn, my communications officer knocked on my office door and stood in the frame with an expression I had not seen on her before. Ambassador Morton. A transmission on Council standard frequency. 47 years. Not one signal in 47 years. Who sent it? I asked. A Dorvathy ambassador named Maxair. She paused for exactly the right amount of time. He says they need to speak with us. I took the pen from the drawer. Matte black, empty for 38 years, slightly chewed at the cap. Tell him we received his message, I said. Tell him we will be in touch. I did not share what I was thinking. What I was thinking was that the galaxy had expelled us 47 years ago for being too much trouble. I was genuinely curious what kind of trouble had finally made it willing to call. The Dorvathy scout ship Captain Boyd brought in was in poor condition, not from damage, but from 11 days of continuous operation at limits it was not designed to sustain. The hull was intact. The systems were functional. What the ship looked like was a vessel that had been pushed by someone who could not afford to slow down. The pilot, a young Dorvathy named Sinvale, had been at his controls for so long that when Boyd's crew brought him aboard, his bioluminescent output had faded to almost nothing. In his species, that was what complete physical and cognitive exhaustion looked like. My medical team kept him for 36 hours before he was stable enough to talk properly. When he could talk, what he described confirmed the framework Drake and I had assembled from 6 years of survey data and Boyd's direct observations. But Sinvale had been close to it in a way our instruments had not. He had seen it operate at contact range. He had watched it process 2 Dorvathy fleet vessels in under 4 minutes. He had made the decision to run not because he lacked courage, but because he was the only person in the vicinity who had understood, in that moment, that running was how any of the information survived to reach us. The Velcroth. That was the Council's term for it. Our translation systems rendered the meaning as approximately the feeding dark, which provided a reasonably accurate summary of the situation. It was not a creature in the biological sense. The most accurate description was a predatory system, self-organizing, intelligently directed, enormously capable, and very old. It had existed in the space between the Council's inner systems and the outer arms for at least as long as the Council's own records went back. The records, as it turned out, went back 300 years on this specific subject. For 300 years, the Council had known about it. For 300 years, the Council had been managing it. The management arrangement was simple in the way that deeply wrong things often are. Every decade or so, when the Velcroth's attention began drifting toward core systems or high-value member worlds, the Council would quietly redirect its path toward a world that had been identified, through internal calculation and without public discussion, as an acceptable trade. Not trade literally. The word I am looking for is sacrifice, and I am using the more comfortable word deliberately, because I want you to understand how comfortable the Council had become with the arrangement. Sinvale had found the records by accident, in a classified archive that a senior Council administrator had apparently failed to lock correctly. The kind of thing that happens when an institution has held a secret for so long that the people maintaining it have stopped treating it as something that requires active protection, because they have forgotten that anyone outside the institution exists who might care. He had kept the information to himself for 3 years. Then the Velcroth had moved closer to the Dorvathy core systems than it had in living memory, and the Council's redirection attempt had not held, and Sinvale had decided that the species expelled 47 years ago for being too volatile, too aggressive, too stubborn to cooperate with civilized arrangements, were probably the only people in the galaxy who might actually do something about this. He had pointed his ship at human space and pushed it as hard as it would go. I sat across from him in a small conference room aboard Drake's command vessel, with Boyd to my left and Drake to my right, and I let him finish everything he had to say without interrupting. When he was done, the room was quiet for a while. Then I opened the folder on the table between us. 6 years of deep survey data. Intercepted Council archive material gathered over 4 decades. Boyd's direct observational reports. And a single number I had assembled myself, over several nights, cross-referencing Council records against every inhabited world database we had built, checking the arithmetic until I was entirely certain of it. 847 worlds. That was how many inhabited worlds the Council had directed the Velcroth toward across 300 years of management. Some held only a few thousand people. Some held considerably more. All of them were gone, and most of them had gone from the galactic record quietly enough that, outside the classified archives, there was almost nothing left to confirm they had ever been there. Sunvale looked at the number and his bioluminescent output dropped to almost nothing. Did you know? Boyd asked him. I found the number in the archives, he said. I did not know before that. I closed the folder. I did not name what I was feeling. There are feelings that do not benefit from being named while you are sitting in a room with people who need you to be functional. I took the pen from my coat pocket and set it on the table. Just set it there. I do not know why. It was a habit by then. Where is it currently moving? I asked. Toward the inner systems, Sunvale said. Directly. The Council has been running new redirection calculations for 2 years and none of them are working. Its behavior has shifted. The prepared corridors are not holding its attention. He paused. It has learned, we believe, that the paths being prepared for it are not natural. It has started avoiding them. It learned, Drake said. Yes. Boyd and Drake looked at me. I looked at the folder. It started learning, I said, approximately 24 years ago. The room was quiet. What I was describing was this: 24 years into our isolation, our survey teams had pushed into the deep transit corridors where the Velcroth had historically operated. We had not known that was what those corridors were. We had been mapping. Expanding. Doing what we did, which was press outward into everything we could reach and document it and understand it and decide what came next. When the Velcroth came toward us, we had not run. We had not known that running was the established protocol. Nobody had told us. And even if they had, I am not confident it would have produced a different result. We had been angry for 24 years. We had spent 24 years building things specifically because we were angry and building was how we handled it. When something enormous and apparently hostile moved into our territory in a way that felt deliberate, the human response to that situation had never been complicated. We pushed back. We lost ships. We adapted and built different ones. We lost those. We adapted further and built stranger ones, designed around what the first losses had taught us. We developed tactics in the field because there was no existing manual for engaging something the galaxy had been appeasing for 3 centuries. Every loss gave us information. Every loss produced an adjustment. The Velcroth encountered, for the first time in the entirety of its recorded existence, a species that treated the beginning of an annihilation attempt as a starting point for a technical problem rather than a fait accompli. Its advance toward human space had slowed, then stalled, then stopped. It had turned its attention elsewhere. Toward softer territory. Toward corridors where things did not push back. Toward the Council's inner worlds, where 3 centuries of appeasement had produced exactly the military capacity you would expect from a civilization that had never needed to fight anything. Which was how we had ended up in this room. I looked at Sunvale. He was exhausted and still slightly afraid, but managing both things with the careful dignity of someone who had traveled a long way to do something that mattered. Your ambassador contacted us, I said. Maxer. Tell me what the Council is prepared to offer. He told me. I listened to all of it. Readmission to the Council with full restoration of prior status. A formal public apology, broadcast on all standard Council frequencies. A permanent seat on the primary governing panel with enhanced voting weight. Full access to all Council trade and scientific exchange infrastructure. Formal recognition of all territorial expansion conducted during our isolation. It was everything the Council could offer. More than we had been given across 11 years of legitimate membership. I listened to all of it and let the room hold the silence for a moment. Tell Maxer we will receive a full delegation in 11 days, I said. Every ambassador currently serving who voted in year 47. Tell him this is not optional. Sunvale transmitted the message. I sat alone in that conference room after everyone else left, with the folder of 847 worlds on the table in front of me and the empty pen in my hand. Some of the species on that list had made it into the broader galactic record before they disappeared. Most had not. A few had had their own languages, their own histories, their own words for things that no one had thought to preserve because no one had known they were about to stop existing. I held the pen and looked at the folder for a long time. 11 days was not much time to finish preparing for a meeting I had been preparing for, one way or another, since I walked out of a council chamber 47 years ago and heard the doors seal behind me. But 11 days was what we had. The council delegation arrived on schedule. 12 ambassadors, the highest-ranking active members of 12 species that had voted in the chamber 47 years earlier. Max Air led them, formally dressed in the layered ceremonial cloth his species reserved for occasions of significant, and as yet uncertain, diplomatic weight. His bioluminescence was set to the steady silver that Dorvathy diplomatic training prescribed for situations where standing had not yet been established. 2 of the other 11 I recognized from decades of intercepted council communications. The remaining 9 had come to their positions during the years of our absence. They had expected, I believe, to dock at something near the old border. A station in familiar territory. Something that would have told them they were meeting us on the edge of where we existed. They docked at Meridian Station instead, which was 380 light-years past the old border. The border they had drawn around us 47 years ago was, by this point, well behind the most recently settled regions of human space. Their navigation systems had logged 4 automated boundary alerts during the final approach, all of them referencing borders that did not appear on any charts they carried. Max Air did not comment on this when he disembarked. He was a more composed diplomat than Selvorn had been, or he had been briefed thoroughly enough to understand that expressing surprise at this stage would be a poor opening position. I met them at the docking level. No ceremony. No formal arrangement of any kind. Working coat, not dress uniform, because I had stopped performing deference 47 years ago and saw no reason to resume it now. My aide, Colin Hart, stood 2 steps behind me. Drake was monitoring the station through the comm system. Boyd was on her ship. Ambassador Morton, Max Air said. His voice was controlled. His silver held steady. Thank you for receiving us. I said I would, I said. Come with me. I brought them to the station's secondary cargo bay. This is the part of the story that people later tended to read as symbolic. The converted cargo bay instead of a formal reception hall. At the time, the decision was simpler than it appeared. The formal halls were occupied with ordinary station business, and a large plain table with chairs around it served the functional requirements of the meeting as well as any more elaborate arrangement would have. The table was metal. The chairs were functional, durable, comfortable enough for a long conversation, and entirely unsuitable for projecting any kind of grandeur. I had checked on this personally. I sat at one end of the table. Hart sat to my left. 12 ambassadors settled into seats across from us with the careful, measured movements of people who were not sure how far it was appropriate to relax. Max Air opened. His preparation was evident, the offer was comprehensive, well-structured, and delivered with the precision of someone who had rehearsed it many times and was determined to give it correctly. He covered readmission, full restoration of prior standing, the formal public apology to be broadcast on all council frequencies, the enhanced panel seat with weighted voting, territorial recognition, full infrastructure access. He included provisions he had not sent through Sunvale, additional guarantees around scientific exchange and permanent diplomatic protections. He finished. The room was quiet. I looked at him for a moment. Then I looked, slowly and without hurrying, at each of the 12 ambassadors. I took the time to look at each face. Some of them held my gaze. Some looked at the table surface. I noted which was which. How many worlds did you feed to it? I asked. The room went very still. Max Air's silver bioluminescence flickered once. The SEKRA representative at the far end stopped vibrating entirely. 2 ambassadors I did not recognize found the tabletop suddenly interesting. Before anyone answers, I said, I want to be clear that I already have the number. I have been building the record for 6 years from intercepted archive material and our own survey data. I am asking because I want to see who in this room tells the truth when it would be more comfortable not to. A long silence. Drev spoke first. 47 years had passed. His species aged slowly. He looked nearly the same careful way of sitting, the same eyes that took a long time with things before responding. He was not the Grethely ambassador anymore. He had come in a senior council oversight capacity, one of the positions created to monitor the management arrangements that, I now understood, included the arrangement we were here to discuss. 847, he said. His voice was quiet and not quite steady. Another silence. Then Sev, from the Velnoth delegation, the same species that had voted against expulsion in year 47, a young official whose people's systems bordered the historic tribute corridors. 847, she confirmed. The archive was classified at the highest restriction level for the full period. Most serving members were not given access. I looked at the remaining 10. None of them spoke. I noted who each of them was. I reached beside my chair and brought out a folder and placed it on the table. Physical paper, printed on Earth stock. In a room occupied by species that transmitted everything in compressed light data packets, a folder of printed paper from Earth made a specific kind of statement. It said, "We still make things in the old way when the occasion requires it." It said, "This is not a display file, it is a document." It said, "What is written here is for the permanent record in the most enduring form we know how to produce." I slid it to the center of the table. "Those are our terms," I said. Maxer looked at the folder, then at me. "You have not yet heard the full range of our offer. There are additional provisions regarding resource access and—" "I heard the offer," I said. It was complete and clearly presented, and I genuinely appreciate the preparation that went into it. "These are our terms." He opened the folder. The others leaned inward to read. The SEKRA representative began a low, uncertain vibration, then stopped. One of the unidentified ambassadors set the pages back carefully and sat very still for a moment before picking them up again to reread them. What was in the folder was not a request to come back. We did not want the old seat. The old seat was a courtesy at a table where the decisions had already been made before the meeting started and the members had already been briefed before the vote opened. What was in the folder was a structural proposal. A permanent veto over tribute-related policy, border designation frameworks, and conflict management decisions, held by a joint human and council oversight body that humanity would design and administer. A complete audit of all classified council records for the preceding 300 years, conducted by independent research teams that included human scholars, with all findings made available to every council member species publicly and without restriction. An immediate and full disclosure of the Velkroth situation to all 412 council member species, in terms that were accurate and complete, without further management of what they were allowed to know about their own situation. And one more provision. Humanity will address the Velkroth directly, I said. Not as a service to this body. Not as a negotiated element of any arrangement. We have been engaging with it for 24 years because it entered our territory, and we do not leave things unfinished. We will finish this work regardless of what is decided in this room today. The question this meeting answers is only what relationship exists between us while we do it. That is, Maxer paused. That represents an extraordinary military undertaking. Yes, I said. The Velkroth has never been successfully opposed in the full historical record. I know, I said. Our analysts have been thorough on that point. A longer silence than any of the previous ones. Drev looked at me across the table and held the look for long enough that I understood it was deliberate. If we accept these terms, he said, what you are building supersedes the Council as the governing framework for this community. It supersedes the parts of it, I said, that made 847 inhabited worlds an acceptable administrative calculation. The rest can stay. He looked at the folder. We will need time to review this fully, Maxer said. Take whatever time you need, I said. I stood. I picked up the pen from the table where I had placed it when I sat down, and put it back in my coat pocket. The station's hospitality resources and full communications access are available to your delegation for as long as you choose to stay. I nodded to Hart. He opened the cargo bay door. The ambassador's aide will see you to your accommodations, I told the delegation. I walked out. Behind me, 12 ambassadors sat around a metal table in a converted cargo bay, reading terms on printed paper in a station 380 light-years past the border they had drawn around us 47 years before. I did not look back. I had stopped looking back 47 years ago. The habit had served me well. They signed on the 11th day. All 12 of them, in an order that I suspected reflected several days of internal negotiation I had not been party to. Maxer signed first, the Dorvathy method, a sustained light pattern held against the signature panel for 3 seconds, his silver bioluminescence shifting briefly to a color I had not seen his species use before and could not immediately classify. Drev signed in the Grethely way, 3 fingers pressed flat against the panel, the touch held longer than the protocol required. The SEKRA representative's signing method appeared violent to the unprepared observer and was apparently deeply ceremonial. Each of the 12 used their own form, their own convention, their own understanding of what a binding commitment looked like. Hart notarized the document without commentary. After 20 years of working with me, he understood that some moments are honored best by doing the necessary thing efficiently and then being quiet. The full council ratification process took another 9 months, because extending the new framework to all 412 member species required separate internal votes in most of them, and votes required debate, and debate required time. We were patient. We had been patient for 47 years already, and we had learned, in that time, that patience directed at a clear destination is not the same thing as waiting. Every member body ratified. The margin in the Dorothy body was the one I noted most carefully, sitting alone in my office the evening the final count came in. 397 in favor. 15 opposed. Not 409 to 3. I did not say anything out loud about this. I held it in the part of the mind reserved for things that matter too much for words to do them justice, filed it next to 11 years of diplomatic dinners and 40 seconds of speaking time and a laugh in an empty corridor, and I left it there. The engagement with the Velcroth had been ongoing in practical terms for 24 years by the time the formal campaign designation was established, so the formality of the designation was largely administrative. What the ratification added was council intelligence support, which was valuable because their archives contained 300 years of observational data on the Velcroth's behavioral patterns. It added access to the monitoring station network across the inner systems. It added clearance to operate in corridors that had previously been restricted. The data was useful. The clearances were useful. Drake used both. He ran the operational planning from his command vessel. Boyd led the forward engagement units, which suited her considerably better than the survey posting she had held in the years of preparation. I stayed out of the military decisions because I was a diplomat and I had spent 47 years being honest about what that meant and what it did not mean. My work during the campaign was everything else. The politics of it occupied most of my time. Keeping the 412 member species informed, stable, and engaged with a process they had not chosen and were only beginning to understand the full scope of. The intelligence coordination between human military operations and council monitoring assets, which required building functional working relationships between institutional cultures that had never had to cooperate before. The public communication architecture, because full transparency to all member species had been a non-negotiable term, which meant we were telling civilizations that had lived adjacent to a 300-year secret that the secret was over and here was its complete accounting. That work was not easy. The Velnoth species, whose systems bordered the historic tribute corridors closely enough that some of what had passed through those corridors had been briefly visible to their long-range instruments before those instruments were quietly redirected by council administrators, had a public processing period that extended nearly 2 years. They had known some of the species on the list. Brief diplomatic contacts, minor trade relationships, the kind of casual galactic acquaintance that builds between bordering civilizations over time. They had not known what happened to them. They had noticed the absence, eventually. They had been given explanations that did not include the truth. Now they had the truth. I made 4 extended visits to their primary administrative station during those 2 years. I sat in rooms with their senior council members and answered every question they put to me, including the ones that had no good answers. There are questions about institutional failure on a scale of 847 worlds that do not have good answers. The honest response to some questions is to say, this happened, it was wrong, it cannot be undone, and the best available path forward is the one we are currently on. Sometimes that is all there is. They asked those questions and I gave that answer and I sat with them in the silence that followed it and did not try to fill the silence with something more comfortable. Some of the other member species were less focused on the historical accounting and more concerned about the new governance framework, specifically about whether humanity was constructing a mechanism for controlling the galactic community under the appearance of reforming it. This concern was not unreasonable and I did not treat it as such. I made the same argument in those conversations that I had made in the cargo bay. What we were building was not a structure designed to put humanity above the community. It was a structure designed to ensure that the community's institutions were accountable to its members rather than managing them, and that the distinction between those two things would never again be treated as optional. The argument was received with varying degrees of conviction. I was not discouraged by this. I had spent 11 years in a council chamber where I was consistently the least powerful person in the room and had learned to think in longer timescales than a single persuasive conversation. Drake's campaign proceeded through 3 distinct phases across 11 years. The first was sustained contact, pressing continuously against the Velcrotha's approach vectors, forcing constant engagement, not allowing it the intervals of calm in which it had historically reoriented and selected new targets. This phase cost us heavily in ships and in crew, and the cost was not evenly distributed across the years. The losses in year 2 of the campaign were the ones I still carry in a specific way. A forward unit of 14 ships, well commanded and well equipped, met the Velcroth in a transit corridor near the old border under conditions that their intelligence had assessed as manageable. The engagement went wrong in a way that the models had not anticipated, because the Velcroth had adapted to the specific tactical approach we had been using in that sector of the operation. We lost all 14 ships. I sat in my office and read through the crew manifests for a long time after the report arrived. Not the summary figures. The names, one by one, from each of the 14 vessels. Then I called Drake. He had already been on the line with Boyd for 2 hours. "What do we need?" I asked. He gave me a list. Resources, equipment adjustments, personnel reallocations, 3 specific research requests for our development teams based on what the engagement data had shown. It was a long list. Every item on it was actionable with what we currently had available. "Get it done," I said. We did not stop. We adapted and we continued, because stopping was not a position we had available to us, and continuing with adjustment was what we had done for 24 years already, and we understood how to do it. The second phase of the campaign was establishing the defensive line. 3 transit corridors, simultaneously blocked and held across a span of 2 years. The Velcroth had not encountered sustained resistance to territorial access in its recorded history. It tested the line from 4 different approach angles over 8 months. None of them produced a breach. In year 7 of the campaign, for the first time in the historical record, the Velcroth stopped advancing. The third phase was Boyd's. A withdrawal is a movement, and a movement reveals vectors, and vectors, for Boyd, were the beginning of a plan. She followed the withdrawal from both positions simultaneously, maintaining contact without overextending the line, pressing where the resistance was weakest, documenting everything for Drake's planning team. The Velcroth adapted. Boyd adapted faster. In year 9 it began pulling back from its established positions in the inner systems. In year 10 it was moving consistently away from Council-inhabited space for the first time in a generation. Drake's long-range planning for this scenario was 3 years old by the time it became operationally relevant. It ran as designed. In year 11, in a transit corridor in the deep outer arm, in space that no inhabited world had been near in a century, the Velcroth's coherent mass disintegrated. The engagement that produced this result ran for 2 days without stopping. 43 ships. The final hours of it on the long-range sensors produced readings that several of the bridge crews could not describe to each other afterward in language that felt adequate. Boyd sent me a 3-word message when it was done. She was not a person who used words beyond what the situation required. It read, "That's the end." I was 69 years old. I had been carrying the pen for 47 years, empty for 38 of them, held on to past any practical purpose because some habits outlast their origins. I sat in my office with the pen in my hand and looked at nothing in particular for a while. I thought about the chamber. The amber shifting to gold. The SEKRA vibrating since before I sat down. 40 seconds. The laugh that had genuinely surprised me. I felt something quieter than a laugh this time, and considerably harder to put into words. I left it unnamed. Some things settle better when you let them find their own shape in the space where you hold them. The accord was formally established 2 months after the end of the campaign. It was not the old council structure administered by different people. The assumptions were different. The accountability structures were different. The fundamental purpose was stated differently, in language that had been fought over word by word during 3 years of drafting work by a team that included human constitutional scholars, Dorvathy legal theorists, Velnoth historians who had spent 2 years sitting with questions that had no good answers, and a Grethma delegation who turned out, when given a genuine forum, to have produced 30 years of careful institutional thinking they had been waiting for the right occasion to share. The Grethma had been principled in year 47 and they were principled in the design work. Some species, in my experience, mean what they sign when they sign it. That is not a common quality. I valued it. The first formal session of the Accord was held in a new chamber built for the purpose, on a station positioned at the midpoint between what had been human space and what had been the old council core. The room was circular. Every delegation sat at equal distance from the center. No gallery rows. No elevated positions. No visual hierarchy of any kind. The center of the room was empty, which was a design feature I had argued for until it was included. In the old chamber, the center had belonged to the secretary. In the new chamber, the center belonged to no one, because the institution it housed governed on behalf of all its members rather than from a position above them. The first session of the Accord opened on a morning in late station autumn, 60 years after the day I had walked out of a chamber with a pen in my pocket and heard the doors seal behind me. I was 71 years old. I attended in a courtesy capacity, as a witness, because Hart had informed me with quiet firmness that my presence was expected and that I should make no attempt to recategorize it as optional. Hart had been my aide for 20 years and had earned the right to be firm about the things he felt firmly about. Every seat in the chamber was filled. 412 species, full attendance, the same full attendance that the old chamber had reserved for history-scale events. I found my seat in the Earth section. Set my coat on the chair back. Took the pen from my pocket. I held it for a moment. Matte black, chewed at the cap. Empty for 38 years. Then I set it on the table in front of me. I did not explain why I did this. No one near me asked. The Earth delegation to either side of me glanced at the pen and looked forward, which was the correct response from people who had watched me carry it to every significant moment for decades. They had stopped expecting explanations a long time ago. Across the chamber, Drev caught my eye. He held it. Not the way he had looked away from me in the old chamber all those years ago, not the careful avoidance of someone who has made a decision they are not proud of. He held it directly, for the length of time that meant something. I gave him a short nod. He held very still in the way his species did when something was settling in them that mattered. Sev, from the Velnoth section, raised a hand in greeting from across the room. I returned it. The session opened with a reading of the Accord Charter. Before any business was conducted, before any provision was discussed, before any procedural matter was addressed, the Charter's preamble was read into the record in full. The preamble contained 847 names. One for each world the old arrangement had cost. Read in 4 languages. The Dorvathy, the Grethli, the Velnoth, and the Grethma, because those were the 4 species whose members had spoken the truth in that cargo bay or before it or after it, and because the names deserved to be spoken in languages that their speakers had chosen to be accountable. It took a long time to read. 412 chambers sat in complete silence while Maxair read each name in the Dorvathy language, and a Velnoth official read the same list in hers, and a Grethli council member read it in the careful, measured way his species read important things, and a Grethma elder read it last, in a language that very few people in the room had ever heard spoken at full length before. Nobody looked at the clock. Nobody shifted. Nobody found reasons to check their data devices or consult with their aides. They listened. When the reading was done, the session moved to its first formal item of business, a trade route dispute between 2 member species whose systems abutted each other in the 3rd quadrant. A matter of corridor access rights and schedule priorities. Entirely ordinary. Resolved in 45 minutes through standard arbitration procedures, which produced an outcome both parties found acceptable. That was the point. That was exactly the point. The work of governance is mostly ordinary. It is trade routes and schedule disputes and resource allocation and the long patient work of keeping 412 civilizations from generating the kind of friction that becomes something worse. The extraordinary moments are the ones that create the conditions for the ordinary work to happen, and then the ordinary work is what actually matters, day after day, across the years. After the session closed, I stayed in my seat for a while. The chamber emptied gradually. Delegations gathering their materials, the low sounds of hundreds of conversations beginning, aides with data tablets moving between the sections, the particular quiet energy of something new that has not yet had the chance to become familiar. I sat with it. The pen was on the table where I had placed it. I picked it up. Turned it in my hand the way I had turned it in my hand for 60 years. Transit shop pen, bought in a hurry on a nervous morning. 11 years of active service and 38 years of emptiness since. Worth almost nothing in any measurable sense. I put it in my pocket. I stood, picked up my coat, and walked out of the chamber. The corridor outside was full of delegations moving between the first session and their next obligations. The ordinary motion of a station in full operation. Cold recycled air, the same recycled air smell that every station in every system had always had, the smell that had always told me, in the way that smells tell you things before your mind has assembled a reason, that this was a place where people had decided to live. I thought about the old chamber for a moment. The 409 votes. The amber shifting to gold. The laugh. 40 seconds and a door ceiling behind me and a transit shop pen in my pocket, and then 47 years of building in the dark that the galaxy mistook for disappearing. The galaxy had called us volatile. Emotionally incompatible with a civilized galactic order. Too much of everything that made cooperation possible. We were. We still were. The difference was that 412 species had now signed a document acknowledging, in language that would stand in the formal record for as long as records were kept, that too much of the right things, applied in the right direction at the moment that required them, was exactly what the situation had called for. Not in spite of what we were. Because of it. The pen stayed in my pocket. I had a meeting in 20 minutes. A briefing from Hart afterward on the second quarter accord implementation schedule. A call with Boyd in the evening, who had taken a deep space survey appointment and was, according to the reports reaching me through official channels, already generating productive chaos in the outer mapping programs in a way that her supervisors found simultaneously exhausting and extremely useful. Ordinary work. The kind that follows the extraordinary kind and lasts longer and, in the end, matters just as much. I walked to my meeting. The station hummed around me. Thousands of species in the same enclosed space, breathing the same air, building the same next thing, pointed toward whatever the galaxy held that we had not mapped yet. We were in it. We were staying in it. On our terms.